is Totally 80s, the podcast dedicated to the music of the greatest decade ever. So, turn up your Walkman, loosen that scrunchie, and get ready to talk 80s with your host, Lyndsey Parker.
Hi, I'm Lyndsey Parker from Yahoo Entertainment and SiriusXM Volume, and welcome to another episode of Totally 80s. We love hearing from you, so why not take a second to follow us at Totally 80s on Facebook and Instagram, or email us your comments and show ideas to podcast@totally80s.com. And just a reminder, if you want to see our faces, you can also catch this episode on video on our Totally 80s YouTube channel, so go there and check that out. And joining me today, as always, is my partner in all things 80s, the differ to my Tilbrook, John Hughes.
Hi, Lyndsey. That's what I like about you.
You know, I think we're getting the knack for this podcasting thing.
I'm trying to think of a Cheap Trick song real quick to make a reference to
Tonight, it's you. Tonight, it's you, John. But it's not just you. We have a guest. So people, all these have been hints. We're not real subtle with our hints, are we? Obviously, today's episode is about power pop. And the guest we have today would this be the Jules Holland to our different in Tilbrook? Who would be our third person? Our special guest today is a musician, songwriter, journalist, and author who has written biographies for Bare Naked Ladies, Todd Rundgren, and a personal favorite of John's, The Kids in the Hall, One Dumb Guy.
Love that.
I need to check that out. He also hosts the Record Store Day podcast, where he has welcomed such folks as Sparks, Fred Armisen, Questlove, Matthew Sweet, and many more. And he, alongside S.W. Lawden, quite literally co-wrote and co-edited the books on power pop, titled Go All the Way, A Literary Appreciation of Power Pop, and its sequel, Go Further, More Literary Appreciations of Power Pop, Electric Boogaloo 2, something like that. I have to do that to every sequel. That's a different genre. We'll talk about this some other time. So that's why he is here today to talk about power pop with us, specifically, of course, power pop of the 1980s. We are very happy to welcome to Totally 80s, Paul Myers.
Hey.
Hello. Hi. Good to be here.
It's going to be a powerful conversation. Well, you know, we should probably just jump right into it, because I am a member of a very well-trafficked, hundreds, thousands of people. It's a power pop group on Facebook. And everyone just spends most of the time arguing about what power pop is. It's a genre that's hard to define. You know it when you hear it, but you don't always know how to explain it. As we mentioned, you quite literally wrote the book on the genre. So how are we defining power pop today?
Well, I thought I would read an excerpt that I wrote from the very introduction of Go All the Way, the first volume.
Yeah.
And I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just read you what I wrote for this. This is about a paragraph, if you don't mind, a recitation, if you will.
No, man. I mean, this is the textbook on it. Let's do it.
Okay, here we go. For me, explaining the meaning of power pop is a little like explaining what love is. You know it when you feel it, but damn if it's not different for everyone who experiences it. As a songwriter, I've always had a special place in my heart for what I defined as power pop, and it has always made me feel young and excited, swept up in the euphoric spell of the eternal now. It's Friday or Saturday night, you just got paid, that girl or guy from school just saw you at the mall, and the limitless potential for adventure is laid out before you like a chiming Rickenbacker guitar. That's wow. It's a little purple. It's a little purple, but it has a hook. So there you go.
I'm into it. So why is it that there are quite literally debates on Facebook about it, or so many people have different ideas of what it is? And it's this whole, like, I know it when I hear it. I know it when I feel it. Other genres, it's pretty obvious. Like, I can't think of another genre where people debate so much, except maybe goth music, what it is.
You know, I mean, Steve Lawden and I talk about this, my co-editor and co-curator. One of the things we talk about is the fact that there's a point of entry. So if you got into power pop, like some people will talk about Blink-182 as a power pop band, and I can sort of see that.
There'd be other people who would just think that's ultimate blasphemy.
Exactly. And then there's this, and I hate to say it, I hate to get right to it, but then there's this bizarre racial sort of bias. It's like four white guys playing bass guitars and drums, and that's it. And so as we talk about in the second edition, Go Further, you know, Puffy Amiyumi, this Japanese pop band, which I think were power pop in their own way, and they certainly.
They got Jellyfish ties.
Exactly. You took the words. There you go. Sorry. And no, that's fine. No, it's fine. That's the point. And Andrea Warner, who is like a really not a power pop author, she took on this whole idea of the sort of cultural sort of bias that people bring to the, you know, the way Puffy was viewed as this like, cutesy pop girls, when in fact there's some pretty great hooks and they're great songwriters and just that sort of thing. So those discussions, I'm really excited that they've come up in the various different authors that we've had contribute. Our main rule was we both want people that write in a writerly way about the genre, but also not doing the usual, here's the history of the Rembrandts or something like that. It's kind of like stories that are of like, literary value to some degree. Some of them are historical, like Annie Zaleski writes about Jellyfish in Volume 1, and it's very much a story of Jellyfish, but it's through the context of when they leave the charts to go into the power pop underground, and when people become in the charts, do they lose their underground status? And is there an underground thing that's an imperative? Is it only power pop if nobody buys it?
That's a very interesting point that I actually was going to bring up. So I'm glad you did. So in your book, I'm looking at it right now. It's talking about the elements of power pop, which all sound like things that would make it very commercially appealing. The number one is tunefulness. Okay. Tunefulness is usually a requirement for a hit single. Lyrics that counterpoint happy sounding music with yearning or melancholy. Again, that could describe a lot of hit singles. Concision, jangle. These are all things, that are brought up. And also the word pop is in it. Okay. Which is short for popular. So this is all counterintuitive that when we get down to it, there's a lot of talk about like, is being called power pop kind of the kiss of death? Are power pop bands doomed? There are some that are very successful, and I would actually argue that some of the most successful power pop bands were actually ones, even though a lot of people associate power pop, its genesis or its golden era with the 70s. I would actually say the 80s might have been the most commercially fruitful time, and we'll get into that in a moment. But for every commercially successful power pop band that there is in the 80s or otherwise, there are dozens, hundreds that remain cult bands, cult favorites, fan favorites. So why is that? With all the things I just laid out about, like, it seems like power pop should have a very wide, mainstream audience. It very often does not.
I think I described it as being like rockabilly, in the sense that, you have those rockabilly truck meets and car meets, and people are getting invested in the style of rockabilly and the look of rockabilly. And I think there's a point where it just becomes like people see it as a limited set of values. But part of that is its cultness. So there's a fine line, for instance, between what they call like jangle rock from LA and power pop. And there's arguments because the janglers hate the power pop term.
Man, this is a divisive group. It's like the Sharks and the Jets.
No, I mean, and Rick Menck, who's an incredible scholar on rock and roll and a great drummer, and played on all the greats like Matthew Sweet, Velvet Crush, and he's played with Stephen Duffy. He's played with Joe Pernice. He's a really great authority on this stuff and a huge record guy. I think I got a vibe from him that he didn't really dig the term power pop, even though Matthew probably gets 1 million people at the gigs, or not 1 million, but thousands of people at the gigs wanting to identify him as power pop. And maybe that's the reason. I don't know what this is. I mean, this is something I'd like to talk to Rick about, like I said, I have huge respect for Rick from where he's coming from. So I don't come to bury Rick so much as I'm just curious about this conversation. Marshall Crenshaw hates the term and gets mad at people.
I mean, this is a common thing. There's disco bands that don't like to be called disco bands. Will say, no, we're a funk band. There are goth bands, The Cure even, that will say we are not goth. And then, there are power pop bands when, like we say, when we hear it, we know it. We know it's power pop. I don't like
the disco analogy is really good. The disco analogy, I've never thought of it before, but I remember Nile Rodgers, I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he, of course, remembers, the largely racially motivated anti-disco movement. And Chic, who were progenitors of disco music, kept saying, we're a funky dance band. We're a pop band that has funky, danceable songs. Don't call us disco, because disco was Disco Duck, and Saturday Night Fever's image was, shallow. And so, but inversely, this is the thing. It's a lot of power pop bands. When the vibe comes around again, a lot of times people go, well, yeah, we're power pop, like in the same way that maybe Nile today claims disco, and Daft Punk would claim disco now, did until they stopped being a band, and I think that there's a little bit of that too. And I don't understand it. To me, I I think I'm supposed to be some kind of expert, but I think it is evolving, and that's partly why
that's why you're on the show.
But that's why there's 2 volumes of these.
There's got to be a third, I guess, right?
I would hope.
I wonder if it starts at the genesis, like way back with the raspberries and people like that being branded somewhat rightly so as bubble gum, because it was super catchy. It was on AM radio at the time, and they didn't have that credibility as like a Rolling Stones or something like that. That's like pure straight ahead rock. And you know, I would argue the Partridge Family was almost power pop in a lot of respects. So I wonder if that carried all the way
music for kids.
Yeah, well, it carried all the way over to the Knack right as the 70s ended and the 80s, and there was such a nuke the Knack backlash because it came too people felt too soon without earning their stripes, etc. All the things that were tossed at them.
Well, let's talk about that, because I was actually going to bring up the Knack. We made a Knack pun at the top of this, as I want to do. And Paul, you are an expert. That is why you're on the show. So we're going to direct a lot of questions to you. You literally, curated the 2 books. You know what you're talking about. So we're going to start.
I know some stuff. Yeah.
So obviously this is a totally 80s podcast, but as I'm, so we're going to focus obviously on bands from the 80s. But 1979 was just 1 year before, and I would argue, but I'll let you, make the expert argument that the 80s power pop, I don't know if craze, maybe that's a too enthusiastic a word, but the boom, I think there was a bit of boom of power pop in the 80s. There were, as I just mentioned, a lot of power pop bands in the 80s that were huge, very commercially successful and crossed over and were getting MTV play. But would you say that as short-lived as it may have been, the initial massive success of the Knack in 1979 kind of laid the groundwork for that? Because suddenly it seemed like every major label, much like in Seattle in the 1990s, were looking for the next Nirvana. It seemed like in LA, every major label was scouting for the next band in a skinny tie. There was, I think in your book, it calls it a new hope. Like this was power pop bands that sounded and looked like the Knack with short hair and skinny ties and suits and a kind of new waviness to them. That was going to be the next big thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and even the early marketing or the early image of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, there was skinny ties worn and there's Rickenbackers that chime in, and big Birds-like tunes, and there's that post Beatles, post Revolver element to power pop that I think I'm going to make a judgment. At its worst, it's all style and no content when people are just wearing the skinny tie. And, frankly, a lot of bands that had heavy metal hair the week before suddenly had mullets, and because they couldn't cut off all their hair, but they would leave the back long, but they would, and like what
they wanted to keep the party in the back.
Exactly. Yes. And business up front. But they a lot of those guys, I used to call them stereo salesmen, because you'd go into one of those Radio Shack or something places, and all of a sudden all the dudes were suddenly new wave looking, because they'd heard the Cars.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, okay,
so the Cars were an interesting thing. Yeah, the Cars are a Trojan horse, is what they are.
That's what I was going to ask you. Because a lot of they get tagged with new wave, but they're kind of power pop, really.
New wave and power pop are they're in the same lane. And I think there are times when new wave goes away more towards an Eno thing, more towards like a Gary Newman thing. But then there are songs within the new wave that were pure power pop. But, there's also songs in every genre that end up being power pop every so often. You can adopt a power pop sound and not be a power pop band.
So definitely I want to talk about, like I said, the more commercially successful bands of the 80s that could be in some way broadly or not classified as power pop, and definitely the Cars are one of them. But before we go into that, to put a bow on the whole Knack thing, because everybody got the Knack and then they didn't get it and then they didn't want it. And, the Knack had basically, I don't consider them a one-hit wonder, but they basically had one massive hit song. Why was there that backlash? Why was it like this new hope and then it was nope?
I've got thoughts, but I'll let Paul go first.
No, you go first, John.
Well, the second album was a Xerox of the first. But The Little Girls Understand came out in 1980, so we're right in where we need to be now. And you had the first single, Baby Talks Dirty. It was a complete rewrite of My Sharona. I mean,
they also, those lyrics, dude, they did not age well. These Lolita lyrics have got to go.
Doug Feiger got hit a lot for that, but I think a little unfairly, he wasn't the only one writing stuff like that in 1980 and 1979. I mean, to single him out.
literally dating a 16-year-old named Sharona, though,
Well,
when he
she's
was like
still
25 or something. Anyway, I mean, yeah, it was a different time, but definitely it was maybe the fact that it wasn't just one song. It was
it was
you just met, there was My Sharona and The Little Girls Understand,
Right.
Baby Talks Dirty, Good Girls Don't. Like every song was kind of this schoolgirl Lolita thing, jailbait thing. It was a lot. It was very one track minded. Let me just say that.
Yeah.
But you don't think that had anything to do with it?
Oh, I think it had. I mean, the Rolling Stone reviews were just brutal about the lyrics. So no, I think it had a lot to do with it. I think it was also just taking that first album, slapping it on the copy machine, and hitting copy didn't help, because there was neat stuff in the third album. Round Trip is amazing. They grew up. They were really stung. They were really beaten down by the industry, and they kind of came out with this really contrite We're Sorry record with a horrible pick for a first single. Ooh Baby, why would you pick a country waltz for your first single? I don't know. I wasn't at Capitol at the time. But, it's a sad story, because they had a little bit of a comeback at the late 80s, early 90s with that really great album, Rocket of Love, and some great songs. But, it was a cautionary tale for a lot of this stuff. And so, I think it was also jealousy. A lot of people in LA were like, hey, how come these guys got everything and poor 2020 and the Beat are sitting over here going, hey, we have great songs too. We're wearing skinny ties. I'm not sure, but I think just really Xeroxing that first album is a big, big error.
Paul?
We don't know why they did it. I mean, someone knows why. I haven't really researched it, but it would seem to me that, a lot of times, especially at Capitol in those days, there was probably a feeling that we got to get it out fast and make it the same. And maybe Doug and the boys just said, you know what, like, sure, this will buy us some time. We're on the road. We're still riding the Sharona wave. Let's make this record and get it out there. And they probably, when they did that third record, they were probably thinking, okay, now we have a chance to rethink this. And if anything, that single might have been a deliberate way of saying, look, we're not just this thing. In fact, we're not what you think we are. And if it had worked, if it had worked, they would have, we eat like kings, then it's like all the great bands like Squeeze and XTC who had records that sounded different every time out, So
well, they do say, that they had written all the material for the first and second album at the same time. The first album was going to be a double album at one point. So, it kind of goes in there, but I really think it was just because that second album came out less than a year than the first. People forget that. Yeah,
that's a really, power pop aside, just in general, that's such a common story in the industry when you think of from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where, a band is still riding high, an artist is still riding high on, their debut album is still in the charts. Yeah. And already they're being hassled to write a second record. And most of the time it's not as good. Can you think of it? It's like I can't think of an example where someone rushed out their second record and it was better than their first or as good as
Elvis Costello.
Elvis Costello, power pop god that he is. Well, let's get into talking.
Was, much better record than the first one, I think, in some ways.
Well, let's obviously a lot of the people we just mentioned, Elvis Costello, Squeeze, XCC, are definitely going to be. Let's talk about some of the longer lasting success stories of 80s power pop. But is there any more thoughts about the Cars? Because again, we could debate whether they are power pop or not. I certainly think a song like You Might Think, which was, I know, a later song for them, but one of their bigger hits, because it was like, swept the VMAs and stuff like that in 1984. I mean, that's a pure power pop song to me. But what elements did they take of power pop that they incorporated into with other things that made it maybe a little more palatable for a mainstream audience, an MTV audience, because they were huge.
Another great example of a second record that came out right after the first. I mean, I think.
Okay, there you go. I stand corrected. There you go.
I want to follow up on this Cars idea of them being a Trojan horse band, because what they were literally the first sort of post new wave band for everybody. Like, because they had the heavy guitars, Roy Thomas Baker doing the multiple vocal layering, and it was a mega sounding record. Radio loved it, because it was full and rocking, but it was also nimble and smart and informed of the new wave, and had straight up hooks, which made it kind of slightly retro, which was an appealing power pop thing as well as a new wave thing. And it was super smart. Like, in fact, I don't think it was designed by a committee. But if you had spat out a computer program, it would have made the Cars, because the elements. But the thing was, it was a real band. It might have been one of the last of its kind, like a real band where you had Greg Hawkes laying down the modernistic synthesizers, Rick singing in that post new wave style of, very hiccupy, almost Lou Reed at times, and Ben Orr being totally like, the heartthrob with the smooth vocals, but and they had the new wave hair, and the whole thing. And Robinson, the drummer, had been in the Modern Lovers. They had a pedigree, and they were out of Boston, where you had to be real, and so there was something really solid about them that appealed to everybody. And in that way, they brought in hooks, which is a power pop thing. So that's the elements that I think are power pop, is multiple harmonies. Power pop, one of the things I always love about power pop is something like Todd Rundgren's Couldn't I Just Tell You, which is, big chunky guitars, like post The Who, something like that. I mean, Pictures of Lily by The Who is a power pop song to me. And so the idea of multiple harmonies and chugging straight eighth notes, those are the original sort of power pop elements to me. And I still identify those kinds of songs as being power pop, some of the Cheap Trick material. Yeah.
I had the great pleasure of working with Rick Ocasek on the reissues. And I produced those reissues, and had many, many long conversations with him. And Paul, you're more right than you think. The word calculated was never used, but in many interviews I did with him for the marketing around those reissues, it was definitely looking at what was happening, going back on his childhood love of Buddy Holly, but also he loved Iggy Pop. He liked what was happening over here with Suicide and people like that. So it was very much looking at what was going on and saying, we got to make it, guys. How can we make it? And they put it all into this mix, and out came that Cars debut album, which basically could be called Cars Greatest Hits.
I mean, several of their albums the next album could be Cars Greatest Hits Volume 2. But yes, they definitely Trojan horse. I love that analogy. But I do want to talk about Cheap Trick, because obviously you talk about heartthrobs. You got two of them in the band. But although a lot of fans would probably, understandably, say that their heyday was the 70s, the late 70s, but they did put out a lot of amazing albums and songs in the 80s, some of which got overlooked. But overall, decades aside, but just talking about overall career arc, would you say that Cheap Trick is the most commercially successful power pop band? Well, I mean, not counting 60s, because you're talking about people like The Who and the Kinks, but like just in general, like a band that is just like very classified as power pop. I think Cheap Trick might be the most successful one.
I agree. I think, if you look at a song like Surrender, which to me is a power pop song. I mean, and people might not want to call it that. They might be the Cheap Trick fans who are like they're Midwestern rock fans who think like, this is just good Midwestern rock. Shut up with that power pop thing. But I mean, their roots are things like The Move, and they were listening to the Nas. They were informed of all those things. And I think this is coming up a lot, right? I keep saying they were informed by, because there's a lot of referentiality. Is that the word?
Yeah, sure.
In power pop. Power pop is a lot about, musically, it's a lot about referencing. It's a lot about, give me that 12-string guitar from, Roger McGuinn. Give me those harmonies from the Beatles. Give me that crunchy drum sound from, from something like The Who, and those elements. I mean, I think The Who might have been the term. I should know this. I believe there's an argument, but the power pop, the term, was originally something that Pete Townsend was talking about.
Wow.
He wanted to be power pop, and then of course other songs came out. But I mean, definitely the prototype for me is also the Nas's Open My Eyes, which it's kind of a heavy spacey rock song, but there's definitely elements. Certainly by the time Todd Rundgren did Couldn't I Just Tell You, which is that's one of the great lost Who songs as far as I'm concerned. So it's anyway, I'm getting off topic.
Well,
but Cheap Trick definitely they brought it back and made it all right. It made it all right to be that kind of euphoric Candy, the Candy is a great power pop song.
But since this is the totally 80s podcast, most
Right.
of the things we're talking about just now about Cheap Trick have been 70s songs, which is understandable. You know,
Okay.
best live album of all time, in my opinion, is Budokan. Don't at me. I'm right. It's true. But anyway, I don't know if people give the 80s stuff its due because, you know, a lot of people, you know, in the 80s, you know, let's face it, Cheap Trick got a little inconsistent. They did have some clunkers in the mix, and they did, you know, they've had their ups and downs in their career. But I want to talk about some of their 80s stuff. I mean, they've had a lot of great singles. Tonight It's You, I Can't Take It. But I know John will get behind me on this. We'll see how Paul feels about this. Bizarrely, aside from Budokan, the live album, when I pull out a Cheap Trick record to listen to, it's One on One, which is what, 1980? John, what year is that? 82, 81?
That's 83. And
wow, okay.
It was very Roy Thomas Baker. That's why I like it. It's almost a Cars record, honestly.
But people like probably most people would probably not cite that as like one of the great Cheap Trick records. But like two of my favorite Cheap Trick songs are She's Tight, which we all know, if we're talking about being referential, we all know Poison heard that song when they wrote Talk Dirty to Me. I mean, that's a fact. And then If You Want My Love, which is of course like a beautiful Beatlesque love song.
It's a Beatles song.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the One on One album for a second.
Well, before we get to One on One, I think Cheap Trick stumbled out of the gate in the 80s. They had that George Martin produced record.
Next position, please.
No, that was the Todd Rundgren one.
That's
okay. Wow, they worked with some great producers, didn't they?
Well, they were searching. They were they were going, how do we do that? They left the whole Tom Werman scene, and they were trying to find the person who was going to turn them around. And in those days, it was dudes. But you know, they were finding the next dude to produce them, and it was all they were like, the biggest names, we're gonna get them all, you know. And then but go ahead, you wanted to say, John.
Well, on paper, George Martin, the Beatles producer, producing Cheap Trick, a Beatles influenced band, it's gonna be great. And then you have the leadoff single, Stop This Game.
Which album was this? The Doctor.
All Shook Up, great cover. I mean, the cover belies what lies within. You know, you look at this cover and it's very 1980. It's very new wave, and we're heading in there. And then you just get, you know, this uninspired set of songs. I don't know if they were burnt out or what, but One on One is amazing, right? You know, you even have an electro song on there.
I Want Be Man. Saturday at midnight,
which has a 12-inch mix, by the way. I don't know if you ever knew that.
I was unaware of that.
They actually hit the Billboard dance chart with Saturday at Midnight, the extended mix. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I didn't even know that.
Crazy. Yeah. So it's just such a great album, and I think they really benefited from MTV at that time. Those two videos were on a loop.
Can I tell you a funny story about that, directly related to that? So I was watching MTV back then, and I was watching in my parents' room, and my mom came in with laundry or whatever. And, you know, she always was kind of making fun of the boys on MTV that, you know, the pretty boys on MTV that I found attractive, like, you like this. And If You Want My Love video came on, and there was, you know, beautiful golden god Robin Zander with his slightly shorter hair and a suit on. And my mom just stopped in her tracks, and she's like, okay, who is this? She's like, this one is handsome. She's like, is this one of the ones you like? And I'm like, yeah, Mom, that's Robin Zander. He's really hot. And she's like, this one I understand. So yeah, they had that formula. He was in, you know, Tinted Windows, a band we've talked about before with, you know, the great Adam Schlesinger put together with Bunny Carlos and Cheap Trick and Taylor Hansen, who is actually quite a Robin Zander-ish in looks, and James Iha.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But this formula they had of how they sounded, but also kind of their image, like two kind of normal guys or two everymen, and then like two heartthrobs, and, you know, like the image was, you know, the jokiness that Rick and Bunny brought with their image, but then like the prettiness that the other two brought. Like I don't know if they did anything it was made in a lab. I don't know how calculated they were, but it worked. And I do feel that I don't know. I don't know why that didn't really continue for them. Of course, they did have some hits later in the 80s. The Flame was a big hit, and their Elvis cover. What Elvis cover was it? Don't Be Cruel.
Don't Be Cruel, yeah.
But yeah, it seems like their 80s stuff was inconsistent, and they had their moments, but they didn't quite keep up what they'd started in the 70s. But One on One, I think, is a perfect record.
I don't know why they never worked with Roy Thomas Baker again, because they seem to really enjoy it. There is on YouTube, there is a video of them doing a live performance from that era on some show. I'm trying to figure out what show it's from, but Roy Thomas Baker is the host. And he's,
really?
and he's on stage with them, introducing them. It's super awkward. It's amazing. You got to see it.
I need to find this. Is it
Okay,
on YouTube?
Yeah.
Sidebar. The golden era of producers as like, you know, flying squadron captains, the idea that you would front with your producer, like that you would like bring your name producer out as though it was like a director of a film, you know, like here's Quentin Tarantino to introduce the new film, you know, and you know, that's definitely something that we've, like, I wrote this book about Todd Rundgren, and one of the things I said was he was from the golden age of producers, you know, when you had mega king producers, you know, who were, you know, like his name on a record. I'm not going on a Todd tangent here, I hope, but
that's all right if you do. It's quite all right.
His name on a record was one of those things, like George Martin was, and like Roy Thomas Baker was.
Well, that's interesting, Paul. Yeah. What are some other of the power pop genre, specifically of the 80s? Were there other producers that were sort of like those marquee level producers?
You know, was it Jimmy Einer who did the Raspberries? Might have been one of the ones.
Mike Chapman.
Mike Chapman, of course, Mike Chapman. It's right in front of us all.
Yeah.
Because and Richard
Gotterer.
Is that how you Gotterer?
Yeah, well, that's actually something I wanted to bring up, because that's a perfect segue to the next band I wanted to bring up. Because you were talking about how, like, when it came to producers, it was mostly about dudes, and it, you know, quite frankly, still is. But when I look at some of the great, it's just not, well, it's not your fault, but
it is what it is.
You're just staying the facts. But when I look at some of the big commercially successful acts of the 80s that could be at least somehow classified as power pop, it was about chicks, man. Like, okay, the Go-Go's, Beauty and the Beat, produced by Richard Gotterer, if I'm pronouncing it right. Is it Gotterer or Gotterer? Whichever way it is. Sounds great either way.
I like yours.
Okay, Gotterer.
Yeah. Beauty and the Beat, one of the great albums.
In my opinion, one of the best debut albums of all time, and definitely a power pop record, 100%. I don't know if the Go-Go's would claim that.
We got the beat for sure. I mean, if anything, they might have had a hard time because they came out of the sort of LA punk world, and probably, but I think deep down, you know, that I've talked to Jane, I've talked to Charlotte. They definitely love big beatly hooks, so they knew what they were doing. You know, they weren't made by a producer. You know.
Absolutely. And some of the other female artists that, like, just to mention them all kind of together, that I feel were some of the marquee artists of 80s power pop. I mean, of course, if we're mentioning the Go-Go's, we need to mention the Bangles, who came from Paisley Underground.
Hero Takes a Fall. Come on.
Yeah.
And then they did, early in their career, the Bangles did Going Down to Liverpool, which was originally a Katrina and the Waves song. Katrina and the Waves were massive. Blondie definitely had some stuff that could be considered power pop. I'd call Kids in America by Kim Wilde, that has power pop elements. Scandal, maybe not everything by Scandal, but Goodbye to You is a power pop song. Josie Cotton, even. Josie Cotton was power pop to me.
That second Scandal record, Beat of a Heart, The Warrior, that's power pop.
You would say The Warrior's power pop?
I think so. I don't think,
but I think it's one of those ones that's everything to everyone who wants it to be. Like it could be because it's like the Pat Benatar thing, you know, where you're. What is Pat Benatar's genre ultimately? I mean, I don't know. I mean, because it changed so much. But, you know, Hit Me With Your Best Shot could have been technically a power pop song, but it could also just be a good old fashioned rock and roll song, like played next to Eddie Money. You know, like, I don't know. Like it's hard.
But I would definitely say most of it's up for every single one's up for debate. But I would definitely say like things like Goodbye to You or Walking on Sunshine or Kids in America or like the entire Convertible Music album by Josie Cotton. A lot of elements of power pop to that, and of course the Bangles, most obvious one.
I would
I'm glad you mentioned Josie Cotton because not enough people do, you know, and definitely, you know, there are some artists who kind of don't get mentioned enough, you know, like was it the Silvers? I think was one of the bands that we haven't talked about.
Holly and the Italians. I have
it written down here. Holly and the Italians.
Holly and the Italians. Okay.
The original.
Are they the ones that did Tell That Girl to Shut Up that Transvision Vamp later recorded?
The original version of Tell That Girl to Shut Up. There's
a lot of girl group. All the bands that I just mentioned, particularly, of course, Josie Cotton, but definitely Holly and the Italians. A lot of girl group kind of 60s elements to that. Of course, the Bangles obviously had that.
I think it's the 90s, but Crash by the Primitives is a great power pop song.
89, you just got in.
Okay, we just squeaked in there. 89.
Yeah. But I mean, that's totally like totally like
that whole resurgence, that the whole movement in the UK where you had a woman fronting a power pop band, Darling Buds, Primitives, Transvision Vamp. It was almost a little wave there near the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. I think the Darling Buds are completely underrated. People forget about them. That first record with Don't Go Round There, and oh, it's amazing. The whole thing, front to back. But we were talking about Katrina and the Waves. I don't want to gloss over them real quick. That is one of my bigger heartbreaks of the 80s, is Katrina and the Waves. Massive overseas still beyond walking.
They won Eurovision in the 90s. The last time England won Eurovision, because they never do, was with a Katrina and the Waves song.
And they just kind of petered out here. Yeah, the second single, "Do You Want Crying," is amazing, and it only got to like number 34, and that was it.
What's your reasoning for that?
Yeah,
I wish I knew the weird picadillos of the American buying public. Who knows?
You know, in our first edition, Go All the Way, Michael Chabon, who's like a great novelist, is a huge power pop fan, and he wrote about the underlying contradiction of power pop and the sadness. All the songs are like the Raspberries' Overnight Sensation. You know, their songs are Big Star's #1 hit record. You know, and they're not #1 hit records or overnight sensation. and the idea that there's a built-in, almost self-effacing, self-defeated quality to it. Like, so a lot of times I don't even know why it is. I wish I could be more helpful there, but I mean, it's just there. It's not surprising like that a band like Badfinger flamed out, you know. It's sad. It's hugely tragic.
Jellyfish, they had a song called "Joining a Fan Club" on their second and last album. No more fan club.
The Ghost at #1 was
Ghost at #1.
Yeah, again,
good point.
They were so. I think maybe if there's anything we're on here, is that possibly power pop specifically, and pop is concerned with pop, and that the subject matter. It's like in the old days, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Well, power pop seems to write songs about itself. You know,
I mean, even the band, they were called Big Star, but they weren't.
That's
Big
the
Stars.
built-in joke of Big Star. Even though joke isn't the word, but the built-in sort of conceit of Big Star is that they were destined or doomed to be a cult band, and in their time they became way more popular after Matthew Sweet and then the
Teenage Fan Club
and Teenage Fan Club, and everybody started like, you know, genuflecting to Alex Chilton and Chris Bell. And, you know,
the Replacements, who a lot of people might call a power pop band, did a whole song about Alex Chilton, which for probably some people was their introduction to who Alex Chilton was. And there are a lot of people who would call at least some elements of the Replacements power pop.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, that one of the great arguments people have is they go, I wouldn't call Replacements or the Ramones, I wouldn't call the Replacements power pop. And then I think, well, again, it's that thing per song. Like some songs are, I mean, Alex Chilton is a power pop song, the song. You know,
Be on the Bus.
Yeah.
I'll Be You, probably. I would maybe.
Sure. The later stuff for sure.
The later stuff, yeah.
Yeah, it's sad. This is a genre that seems to be.
We're making ourselves all sad. We're like, why isn't this more successful?
Westerberg's solo song "World Class Fad" from the
Dyslexic Heart as well.
Those songs are power pop songs in my book.
Mine too.
It's a genre that's littered with heartache. I mean, if you really look at it, they're like you have for people like Phil Seymour, who had this one great hit that's just immortal, Precious to Me, and then he died, you know, and you're just like all this untapped potential that happened, and it's really sad. And Tommy Keene, who was on Geffen, couldn't get a hit no matter what. I was friends with Tommy, and he tells me a great story. He's on a second record. He's eating somewhere in Hollywood, and David Geffen's in the restaurant, and David Geffen is told that one of his artists is here, and Geffen comes over to him and it's like, when are you gonna write me a hit, kid? And Tommy said he was just paralyzed. He had no idea how to react.
Oh man.
And he
was it a joke? Was it a joke, David Geffen?
It was
or no?
Not a joke, and he was dropped right after that. But you know, luckily he was able to really soldier on independently. But just so many heartaches like that from this genre. It's weird.
Well, let's turn it around for a minute and talk about some of the elite success stories, just so we don't get too depressed. So since we were mentioning Josie Cotton, who was, you know, iconically in Valley Girl, we have to talk about the other band that was in Valley Girl that played at the iconic date. That was the Plim Souls. They were, I mean, I guess we can't say they were like a massively successful band, but they were a successful band. And certainly, you know, because of Valley Girl, that put them on the map. Or, you know, what are your thoughts on them, Paul?
Well, A Million Miles Away still comes up on every one of those power pop playlists, you know, from the Spotify ones to the people making their own mixtapes and or make CDs or playlists or whatever. And it is, I've spoken with Peter. I actually know Peter Case fairly well now because he comes through the Bay Area a lot, and I get up and play with him sometimes. And it's really interesting because he's become more known as a folk singer-songwriter kind of guy, bluesy, and he's great at it. But he still has that power pop voice. Even whenever he sings like a Lightnin' Hopkins song, I hear what could have been if he'd taken. I don't think he likes to take power pop the way, I think for him it was a passing fad on his way to the Dylan influence in his life, and that happens, maybe for him it was, something he did when he was younger. I don't think he has any regrets about it. Like, he certainly speaks highly of those days, but I asked him to contribute because he's a good writer. I asked him to contribute to one of our books, and, he kind of did. He was writing a memoir. He didn't really feel like he wanted to be, I don't know what his reason was, but he didn't want to be part of the power pop anthology, I think. And I again, there's that thing. Maybe for him, it represents something that didn't take off the way it was supposed to, or maybe he's embarrassed by it. But I mean, A Million Miles Away, you hear it, and it's like song. Up there with Tommy Keene's When Our Vows Break or something, like those songs that you just go, that's a power pop song,
right?
Well,
gone, and for sure.
Some of the other perfect songs. Some of these are 1-hit wonders or 2-hit wonders, but John made a joke about it at the top of the show. So I mean, one of probably the biggest chart hits that can be classified as power pop of the 80s was What I Like About You by the Romantics, which has been remade over and over. I mean, that song was massive, and that song had kind of, I don't know, is it a 60s garage feel to it? I feel it had a little bit of that to it.
It was much more of a, I think, like an R&B kind of song. It could have been like from the era of Shout or something, like the original Shout, that is. Definitely. And their big follow-up, at least in the market I grew up in, Toronto, Talking in Your Sleep was a little more. It's a great song, but it had a little more like a laid backness to it that wasn't quite as power pop, but it was still very hooky. In fact, you could probably make a great power pop version of that song because the elements are there in the song.
It sounds like a producer got a hold of it and was like,
absolutely, John.
Take this apart, make it MTV ready. Whereas the follow-up, One in a Million, is the Romantics. That sounds like a romantic song, but Walking in Your Sleep was definitely, all right, we're going to tease the hair real high now. Get rid of the red leather. We got black leather now. And you're going to walk through all these supermodels in the video.
And mannequins, right? I feel like I'm thinking there were mannequins in the, was that a fever dream, or was it like?
Probably a combo, but boy, it got to number 3. So
I'm going to throw a random thought here that Super Freak by Rick James and Talking in Your Sleep by the Romantics have the very similar structures to the point where I would love to do a mashup. I can't even imagine, but that don't.
Someone listening, get on that. Someone make that happen. All right. Well, obviously, this has been such a powerful conversation. No pun intended. Actually, pun totally intended. Of course, when it's me, puns are always intended. That this is way too much for one episode. Too much passion, as the Smithereens would say. So we're going to have to get together for part 2. Paul, can you come back and join us?
I certainly can.
Awesome. Well, a special thanks to our guest today, Paul Myers. His books on power pop are available now on Amazon and even in those physical bookstores. Make sure to listen also to his Record Store Day podcast with him and special guests. I've been Lyndsey Parker, and I've been joined today by John Hughes. And we want to thank you for listening. Remember to give us a rate and review on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll catch you next time.
This was Totally 80s, the podcast dedicated to the music of the greatest decade ever. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Totally 80s, and please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Until our next episode, catch you on the flip side.